Hello, everybody. So, I will tell you, I am recording these back to back, but I changed my outfit because I thought that it would be helpful to differentiate the episodes. But we are doing a two for this week. So, if you do not watch live at our Twitch channel, twitch.tv/poopwitchx, normally we do a drop we do a Smutty Saturday every Saturday. This Saturday we do not have a stream, so you guys are not only getting a bonus behind the scenes episode that I just recorded, but we're gonna also record for this Saturday's as well. So, welcome to the Good Girls Club. We are in the Smut Hut and we are going to be reading Manacled. Right now we are going to be reading chapter 13, 14, and 15. If you are unfamiliar with what Manacled is a Draco and Hermione fan fiction based in the world of our normal Harry Potter, only the difference is the good guys did not win at the end of the Great Wizarding War. A synopsis of what's sort of going on is, in our previous episode, you will have heard that Draco and Hermione are still he is still raping her in the hopes of impregnating her, and it has been unsuccessful 2 months in a row. She's unfortunately been raped 10 times. And we discover that she is now going to every 2 months or so getting mind raped by Voldemort. Draco dragged Hermione to Voldemort's lair, essentially, and he went through her memories. He could not break the memories that she is protected, that time in her imprisonment that has memories she can't even access. He cannot get through those, but instead he did make her relive every trauma she's endured while in Malfoy Manor. We also had a nice little moment where Hermione had a dream, and she remembered a dream she had of her talking to Harry, and this dream was important because it was one of the first cracks that she's having some of her old memories kind of go forward. In the memory, he and her are on the rooftop of some safe house, and he's accusing her of, why have you changed? When did this happen? Why are you the way that you are? And it really is an argument stemming from Hermione wanting the good guys, the Order of the Phoenix, to use dark magic. Not necessarily like the darkest of dark, but to step up, because fighting fire with, a stunning curse is not going to do it. And she said that in that dream, she remembers it was one of 1,000 arguments she had. She also had a very brief moment where she vaguely remembers a conversation with Alistair Moody. She can't make out what they're talking about, but she knows it's important, but she can't make out what it is. And that's really the substantial thing. She's still overcoming her trauma, and also she asked Topsy, one of the house elves at Malfoy Manor, to have a newspaper. Access to a newspaper, and it is the first time she starts folding cranes. So she uses the newspaper, she reads it as many times as she can, and then she cuts it up with her hands and folds cranes, which we'll see a lot more of. So we are going to begin chapter 13. We will start chapter 13. And also, just as a side note, I have a snake clip in my hair now because I thought, why not? It's perfect for Manacled. So, chapter 13. 5 days later, Hermione was seated on the floor by the window folding what was, by her count, her 236th paper crane when the door opened and a young man peered inside. His eyes swept across the room, and when they landed on Hermione, he entered the room and quickly closed the door behind himself. His expression was shifty, and he stared at her intently as he came forward. He seemed hurried. He was solidly built with dark hair and an angular face. He was wearing formal, dark blue dress robes. He had thick stubble across his face. Hermione's instinctive response at the sight of him was utter terror. She froze as though petrified and stared. There was nowhere to run. She couldn't even scream. Sorry, I forgot to mention the trigger warnings. I apologize. I got too excited. Trigger warnings. Please heed the trigger warnings. Rape, mutilation, forced imprisonment, forced breeding, suicide, murder. The list goes on and on. Please heed I will keep reading, but heed the trigger warnings. Okay, let's get back into this. There was nowhere to run. She couldn't even scream. It hadn't ever occurred to her that a stranger might just walk into her room one day. He paused slightly as he approached, noting her expression. "You don't remember me?" he said in a tone of surprise. There seemed to be a hint of offense at his words. Hermione studied him desperately, trying to guess who he was. He seemed vaguely familiar, perhaps from school? Someone she hadn't known well. He kept coming across the room. He was halfway across it, and Hermione's hand started spasming as she struggled to think of what to do. If she bolted, she'd have to get out of earshot, or he could just order her to stop. Perhaps if she plugged her ears, but he could just stun her. She couldn't. He was only a few feet away, and his expression was growing triumphant. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack, and Malfoy appeared beside her out of thin air. Hermione started and shrank towards him, away from the approaching stranger. The intense, triumphant expression on the young man's face faded sharply into indifference at the sight of Malfoy, the shiftiness of his posture falling away as he strained and glanced around Hermione's room. "Lose your way, Montague?" Malfoy asked coldly as he stepped slightly in front of Hermione. Montague shrugged. "Just exploring. I got curious when I saw her. You've got a lot of protective wards on this room, Malfoy." Hermione's eyes darted to the walls. Were there? She never noticed. It was difficult to detect certain types of wards without a wand or a bit of magic to press into them. "The Dark Lord entrusted her to me, with specific instructions regarding her care. It's always useful to know when someone is trespassing," Malfoy replied. His tone was pure ice. Montague laughed. "Is she not allowed visitors?" "She is not," Malfoy said, stepping away from Hermione after giving her the most perfunctory glance. "And if you were just curious, you could have asked me. It's nearly midnight. Perhaps we return to the party? I'm sure Astoria will be waiting for us." Malfoy stalked across the room and waited for Montague to follow him. Montague seemed to intentionally take his time. He glanced around the room again and then back at Hermione. The intensity returned to his eyes as he stared down at her, with Malfoy behind him. There was something he was trying to communicate to her. Then he turned and followed Malfoy out. Hermione stared at the door that closed behind them for several minutes. Montague? Graham Montague? He'd been on the inquisitorial squad, and he'd been a captain of the Slytherin Quidditch team. Fred and George had shoved him into the vanishing cabinet during 5th year. Hermione barely knew him. He barely knew her. When had she known him to the extent that he would expect her to recognize him? While she was thinking, Hermione laid aside the piece of paper her spasming fingers had wrecked. The Malfoys were hosting a New Year's Eve party in the manor. She would have no idea if Montague and Malfoy hadn't appeared. She stood and went to the door, hesitating. She wanted to see people with her own eyes, but the thought also terrified her. If anyone saw her, they could do anything they wanted to her unless Malfoy showed up and stopped them. Her sharp, instinctive relief at his arrival earlier unsettled her in more ways than she had ever wanted to think about. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't. She stood at the door for several minutes before hesitantly opening it. She crept down the hall and slipped into one of the disused servants' passages, winding her way toward the main wing of the house. Gradually, the sound of a string quartet began to reach her ears, accompanied by the buzz of conversation. She stopped and listened. Music. She hadn't heard music in years. She paused and leaned against the wall to absorb it, shutting her eyes and breathing it to the tempo of the strings. She had forgotten how it felt to hear music. After 15 minutes, she remembered herself and continued on her way. She cracked open a door and peeked into a darkened hallway to see if it was clear. She was about to step out when she heard a rustle of fabric and a woman's giggle. Hermione stepped sharply back and watched Astoria dart around the corner, grasping someone's wrist. A male wrist, most distinctly not belonging to Malfoy. Hermione couldn't see clearly in the darkness, but the build of the man was wrong, broader and shorter, and not pale enough or blonde. Astoria leaned back against the wall, and the man closed in on her until Hermione couldn't see the blonde witch at all. Hermione's eyes widened as she giggled, as the giggling gave way to breathy gasps. She hadn't... Well, it wasn't necessarily surprising. Hermione just hadn't expected to encounter it. Suddenly, two milk-white legs became visible as they were wrapped around the man's hips, and the noises took a turn from gasping to moaning. Hermione found herself weirdly fascinated until a horrifying thought occurred to her. Malfoy would find it in her memory. She stepped sharply back and fled silently up the stairs. She took another route toward the ballroom. She had gotten quite good at navigating most of the manor. As long as she didn't rush herself and use the walls as a touchstone, she could go almost anywhere. On the third floor, there was a cramped, twisty little stairway that led to a balcony alcove over the ballroom. Hermione assumed the party was located in the ballroom. She'd hoped to go somewhere where she could listen to conversation, but Astoria's hallway affair had interfered. Hermione replayed what she had witnessed. The act itself wasn't surprising, but the indiscretion seemed excessive. Cheating on her husband in a hallway filled with his family's portraits? Even if it were an open marriage, the overtness seemed impolite. Hermione slipped into the alcove, knelt down, and peeked over the railing down at the party. The ballroom was filled with people, all decked out in their most lavish robes. The room was resplendent in its decorations, glittering. The chandeliers were lit with fairy lights, and in the center of the room, a tower of champagne bell coupes had been constructed and stood at least 6 feet tall. Champagne was flowing down it in an endless magical fountain. It was a party meant for the society pages. There were several photographers snapping pictures for the next morning's paper. Hermione saw Pius Thicknesse and several other important figures in the ministry. There were dozens of Death Eaters Hermione recognized. A flash of pale blonde caught Hermione's eye, and she found Malfoy engaged in conversation with Dolores Umbridge. The warden was dressed in pink and fuchsia dress robes with a plunging neckline and a pendant suggestively nestled in her bosom. Umbridge was simpering and touching Malfoy on the arm while he remained stone-faced. He kept his eyes superstitiously flicking down at her chest in a way that appeared to be a mixture of curiosity and malice. Before Hermione could take further note of the interaction, a scarlet figure caught her attention. She glanced over and then did a double take. There was a surrogate at the party. Hermione's eyes raced across the room, and she realized there were 9 of them there. She stared in astonishment. She couldn't recognize any of them. They were all bonneted and following wizards around as though they were shadows. Their heads were tucked downward and their shoulders curled forward submissively. Some of the wizards they accompanied were Death Eaters. Hermione recognized Amicus Caro, Mulciber, and Avery. The other wizards were younger. She thought one might be Adrian Pusey and another Marcus Flint. The surrogates, Hermione realized as she watched, were being used as status symbols, paraded about to show off a bloodline's importance. Hermione's chest grew tight, and her face twisted as she watched. The women didn't go near each other. Presumably, they had been ordered not to wander. But as 2 of them happened to pass each other, Hermione saw their hands brushed for just an instant. To pass a message, or merely for comfort, Hermione couldn't tell from the distance overhead. Hermione had assumed that the other surrogates were kept cloistered away in houses the way she was. Clearly, it was a mistaken assumption. It was Hermione who was the exceptional case. Order member, hidden memories, blood-bound manacles, given to the High Reeve, taken to Voldemort. It was possible the other girls were even permitted to go out alone. In fact, given that they were traceable, there wasn't necessarily any reason that they couldn't. Perhaps Hermione was even technically allowed to do such a thing, although somehow she doubted it. If she wasn't allowed visitors, it seemed dubious that Malfoy would let her leave the estate. 1 minute till midnight, a witch with a sonorous voice called out gaily, interrupting Hermione's thoughts. Get ready for your New Year's kisses. Astoria swept back into the room. Her robes were straightened and her expression innocent, but there was a faint sense of dishevelment about her person that seemed obvious to Hermione. Her lipstick was faintly smeared so that it didn't rest entirely within the lines of her lips. Not an overt smudge, but enough that the shape of her mouth was carelessly softened. Her expression was smug. Hermione watched Astoria make her way over to Malfoy. Astoria's expression schooled itself into that of affection as she drew closer, but there was a spark of something else in her eyes. Malfoy looked over her carefully, but his expression didn't so much as flicker. Hermione couldn't see Astoria's face well from her angle. 10, 9, 8, 7. The room started chanting a countdown to the new year. As the numbers wound down, Malfoy reached forward, his expression still blank, and ran his thumb across Astoria's mouth. At 0, he leaned forward and pressed his lips against Astoria's. A camera flashed. The room exploded with magical fireworks and cheers and clanking glassware as people toasted. Malfoy's lips remained pressed against Astoria's, but as he kissed his wife, he raised his eyes, looking over Astoria's head. His cool gray eyes immediately locked onto Hermione's face. Hermione forgot to breathe. She stared back, frozen. Her stomach flipped sharply. Her heart started pounding until she could hear it in her ears. She shivered. She felt like she should draw back out of sight, but found herself trapped, as though she were locked in place by the cold silver. He continued to stare up at her until Astoria broke off the kiss and turned away. Then his eyes dropped and a false, aristocratic smile curved across his lips as he glanced around the room, clapping without enthusiasm for several seconds before snatching up a flute of champagne from a floating tray. He knocked it back as though it were mouthwash. Hermione sat back and pressed her hands against her chest and willed her heart to stop pounding. The party lasted for hours. Hermione watched the social interactions carefully, looking for signs of tension and alliances, trying to identify the social order that existed in order to understand what was left out by the Daily Prophet. She spotted Graham Montague mingling and watched him for some time, trying to discern if there was anything familiar about him. He seemed entirely foreign to her. Malfoy did not mingle. He stood and let other people mingle with him. It grew steadily apparent to Hermione which people knew him to be the High Reeve, and which were unaware. There was a sort of reverence and delicacy in how young Death Eaters approached him. Older Death Eaters, like Mulciber and Not Senior and Yaxley, treated him with a mixture of deference and resentment. While others there might not have known why Malfoy was treated so carefully by the Death Eaters, the respect was contagious. The room oriented itself around Malfoy in a way that was unnerving. Malfoy played his part like a benevolent king. The coldness and the sense of danger to his person was undeniable, but he layered it beneath aristocratic courtesy. The hard, unyielding expression he wore around her was absent. He looked indulgent. He smirked and engaged in what appeared to be endless streams of small talk with anyone who approached him. But to Hermione, unable to make out his words and simply watching him, he always seemed cold and bored. It was nearly 4 a.m. before the last guest departed. Hermione made her way cautiously back to her room. She didn't want to run into Astoria again, or any stragglers. When she reached the hallway leading to her room, she peeked around the corner and found Malfoy standing there. He glanced over and caught sight of her immediately. "Have fun?" he asked. She hesitated for several seconds before she walked around the corner and came towards him, shrugging. "It was more interesting than just reading about it," she said. He snorted. "Words I would have never expected to hear from you," he said. Then he stared at her, his eyes narrowed. "Why is Montague interested in you?" he inquired, arching a brow. Hermione glanced up at him. Of course, that was why he was there. She was surprised he was asking. She'd realized, a schedule for examining her memories, approximately every 10 days. He'd skipped the last session and left it to Voldemort, but she was expecting him to show up at some point the next day. If he wanted to, he could have just waited. "I don't know," she said. "I barely knew him in school." Curiosity bloomed in Malfoy's eyes. "Really? How intriguing," he said in a musing tone. "You were so full of surprises." Hermione rolled her eyes. Do you say that to every girl? She said it sarcastically sweet tone. He looked at her sharply and then chuckled. Go to bed, mudblood. Despite the phrasing, it didn't feel like a command. Hermione stared at him for a moment longer before she walked into her room anyway. He was still standing in the hallway when she shut the door. The next morning paper had a picture of Malfoy and Astoria on the cover. It captured the moment Malfoy reached forward and ran his thumb across Astoria's lips before leaning down to kiss her. Fireworks and streamers exploded behind them. It looked sweet and romantic and intimate. On the next page was a picture of the High Reeve killing several people in France. One girl looked vaguely familiar. Hermione thought she might have visited Hogwarts during the Triwizard Tournament. Hermione hadn't realized Malfoy had left the country earlier in the week. Hermione folded the picture of Malfoy and Astoria into a herringbone tessellation and amused herself by making Malfoy and Astoria bounce apart and then squash them into each other. She tore the picture of the High Reeve into tiny strips and wove it into a coaster. In another life, she thought, perhaps she might enjoy creating complex latticeworks pie crusts. Then she stood up and started her exercise routine. She was getting ridiculously fit, which was satisfying, although mostly pointless feeling. It didn't really matter how much of a punch she could pack if she wasn't able to actually drive her fist into Malfoy's face. There wasn't much point in stamina when she nearly had a panic attack every time she pulled her hand away from the yew hedges or tried to move at a speed that wasn't glacial. Malfoy appeared late in the afternoon to go through her memories. He didn't seem to find anything of particular interest in her recent past. He didn't even really react when he encountered her memory of Astoria shagging someone in the hallway. The portrait had probably already informed him. When he finished sorting through her memories, he straightened. Hermione blinked away the headache and sat up, looking at him. I'll be sending a final vial of the potion up tomorrow, he said. Hermione nodded. He didn't say anything else before he turned to go. That night, Hermione laid out a careful plan for the next day in her mind. If it was indeed her last dose of the potion, then there were a number of things she wanted to try to attempt before the effects wore off. The next morning, she did not pause to read the newspaper. She knocked back the potion before she could hesitate or dread the withdrawal she'd suffer later. Then she headed out the door with cool determination. Her first destination was the south wing of the manor, the only part of the house still unexplored. She started up the uppermost floors and worked her way down. They were the ones in which she was less likely to encounter anyone, so she could move more quickly. As she reached the first door, she felt the air take on a cold twistedness that she could detect even through the cushioning effects of the potion. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end, and her body broke out in a cold sweat. Dark magic. It was so thick in the air, she could almost taste it. She froze on the stairway for several minutes, calculating. Hermione's instincts were strongly urging her to turn around and leave, but they were smothered under the potion. Her curiosity wasn't. She descended the last several steps and moved in the direction of the feeling. There was a door ajar. She peeked in. It was a large drawing room, entirely bare, not a stick of furniture, no drapes, no portraits on the wall. Even the wallpaper appeared to have been peeled off. There was nothing but a large cage sitting in the center of the room. The dark magic hung over the room, but seemed most concentrated around the cage. Hermione walked slowly into the room and approached it. People had died in that room. A lot of people. Slowly. Hermione's mind automatically began cataloging the dark rituals she knew of that created such a lasting presence of twisted magic. It had probably corrupted some of the ley lines of the estate. As she drew nearer, she found that the cage was built into the stones of the floor, quite literally irremovable unless the foundation stones of the manor were torn out, and even that might not be enough. She was standing near the cage. Just standing near the cage caused her to taste a tang in her mouth like the copper flavor of blood. She looked it over carefully. It was an inch shorter than her, probably exactly 5 feet tall and about 3 feet wide. Tall enough for a prisoner to stoop or huddle in. She wondered how many people had been kept inside it. A noise startled her. She turned and found Malfoy at the door, staring at her with irritation that bordered on rage. "Of course you would lack the sense not to come in here," he said in a hard voice as he stalked toward her. And that is the end of chapter 13. We are about to begin chapter 14. Oh boy. Hermione turned to face Malfoy calmly. Even without the potion, she doubted she would feel particularly concerned. She stared at him as he approached. She had concluded that generally speaking, he was neither permitted nor inclined to hurt her. Even if he weren't desperate to get into her memories, Stroud had probably spelled out for him exactly why it would be inadvisable to break her psychologically. "Do you keep a lot of people in cages?" she asked. He stared at her. His face was slightly pale, and his eyes were dark and hardened with rage that he was just barely keeping in check. She could feel it twisting around him at the edges. It occurred to her that if she were to try to get him to kill her, it was probably the perfect moment. He was surrounded by the corrupting, addictive, dark magic of the room. She could feel it seeping into her as she stood staring at him. A person could get high casting in an environment like that. Malfoy's lips pressed into a hard line, and she could see his jaw clench. There was so much under his endless cold. A slumbering rage was stirring, rippling just beneath the surface. The drawing room had a strong effect on him. A sly provocation, and she could make him snap. She wondered how to go about it. Then he sneered. "You're the only one I keep caged, mudblood," he said. His expression abruptly became indifferent. The rage seemingly dragged back down. "Haven't you noticed?" Hermione's lip curled. Malfoy glanced around the room. His face seemed drawn, but he smirked down at her. "This is my father's wing of the manor," he said. Hermione looked around sharply, half expecting Lucius Malfoy to pop out from somewhere, wearing a maniacal expression reminiscent of his former sister-in-law. "Luckily for you," Malfoy continued, "he's been abroad since the end of the war. I like to hope that he wouldn't torture and curse you horribly if you happened to cross paths, but if I were a betting man, I'd have to admit the odds are not in your favor. So I advise against regular visits here. Do you want a complete tour before we go, just to assure yourself that there's nothing conveniently lying about for you to murder me with?" He gestured toward the door of the drawing room, and Hermione walked out. He followed her closely and then shut the door firmly. Hermione felt a pulse of magic as it clicked shut. The sense of darkness vanished from the air around them. The door was heavily wrapped in wards. Hermione realized it was probably one of the innumerable rooms she was not meant to enter. She wondered if the other rooms he kept her from were similarly dredged in twisted magic. "Astoria didn't say that there was anywhere I shouldn't go. I assumed I was allowed to explore the whole manor," she said. "I'm sure she would be thrilled if you met an unfortunate end. The indignity of your mere existence aside, it might spell my demise as well. Then she'd become a wealthy widow and free to conduct all her tawdry affairs even more publicly than she already does," Malfoy said in an indifferent tone. Hermione looked up at him. "And you don't care?" He glanced over to Hermione with a cold expression. "I was commanded to marry her, therefore I married her. I was never commanded to care," he said. "You sound as enslaved as I am," Hermione said tauntingly. "No, you sound as enslaved as I am," Hermione said tauntingly. Malfoy stopped short in the hallway and slowly turned to face her, quirking an eyebrow. He surveyed her for several seconds. Hermione stopped and stared back at him. "Are you trying to provoke me or sway my allegiance, mudblood? How terribly audacious of you." Hermione studied his face for several moments before quirking an eyebrow of her own. "You've already thought it. If you haven't, you'd be offended right now," she said. He continued to study her face for several moments before a slow smile curled across his lips. "You know, you almost seem like a Gryffindor again." "I've always been a Gryffindor," she replied. His eyes flashed faintly. "True, I suppose you have," he said. The moments stretched out. They kept staring at each other. Hermione's eyes narrowed as she appraised him. It seemed impossible that he was only 24 years old. No one so young should have such icily restrained rage behind their eyes. Hermione had seen many faces aged by the war, but Malfoy's expression was unique. He was so precisely contained, but his eyes were a storm. They looked like they contained the power of the sea. How many people had he killed? People he knew, people he didn't know. None of it seemed to faze him. His face was somehow unmarked by worry, young and indolent. She could see the war in his eyes, though. All the deaths he had caused and seen, as though the gray in them were their ghosts. Ginny. He'd killed Ginny. Strung her corpse up in front of all of her friends and left it to rot. And Minerva. Poppy Pumphrey, who first taught Hermione healing. Neville. Hermione's first friend in the wizarding world. Moody. Malfoy had killed everyone left after the war. He'd wiped out the Order of the Phoenix. Even under the potion, the hatred and rage she felt toward him for it was inescapable. She did not merely hate him emotionally. The fury over all he had destroyed was a structure in her mind. He deserved to suffer deeply for everything he'd done. She did not need to feel emotions to believe it. She couldn't understand what he got from doing any of it. He was wealthy, but he didn't seem to do anything with it. He was powerful, but he was obliged to keep it anonymous. He had no apparent hobbies other than efficiently killing people and reading. He didn't seem to particularly even enjoy killing people. His life seemed bizarrely empty of anything satisfying. What drove him? She opened her mouth to prod, but caught herself and refrained. She had to tread cautiously. She wanted to think more about it. He smirked when he saw her mouth close. "Composing a psychological sketch of me?" he asked. Hermione quirked her mouth into a faint smile. "Yes," she said. "I'll look forward to seeing it," he said, turning to continue down the hallway. She sniffed and glared after him. There was a sharp click of heels, and Astoria suddenly came around the corner. When she caught sight of Hermione and Malfoy, her eyes narrowed and her lips pursed themselves. "Are we all socializing together now?" Astoria said in a saccharine voice. "Just touring the manor," Malfoy drawled. Astoria's face whitened slightly. The door to the drawing room in the south wing was opened. Perhaps the house elves left it open," Astoria said stiffly. "Indeed," he said with a smirk. "It was undoubtedly the house elves." "I thought you had business today," Astoria said, changing the subject abruptly. "You said your day was quite full when I asked you to stop by the fundraiser this afternoon, and yet here you are, touring the manor." Hermione wavered slightly as she stood between Malfoy and Astoria. There was something intensely unstable about Malfoy's wife, and Hermione was disinclined to draw her attention or ire. However, there was no way for Hermione to withdraw from the tense conversation without being obvious. She remained frozen, watching the scene carefully while trying to be unobtrusive. The words felt laced with implication and mutual dislike. Astoria was seething with barely veiled resentment, her teeth flashing faintly as she glared up at her husband. "The Dark Lord has been quite specific that the mudblood takes precedence over everything else," Malfoy said with a cold expression. Astoria gave a sharp, hysterical laugh. "Ha ha! Goodness, I didn't know heirs were so important," she said, glancing over at Hermione's stomach. "The Dark Lord's instructions are what is important," Malfoy said, beginning to appear bored. He wasn't even looking at his wife. In fact, Hermione realized, he was looking over Astoria's head and staring at a mirror on the wall that reflected himself and Hermione. "If he asked me to farm flobberworms, I would be doing it with equal devotion." Hermione nearly snorted. "I haven't noticed any of the other broodmares needing so much devotion. You don't even let anyone near her. It's like you're hoarding her," Astoria retorted sharply. Malfoy chuckled. A cruel glint entered his eyes as they dropped down to rest on Astoria's face. A flash of uncertainty flickered in Astoria's eyes as though she were caught off guard by the full attention her husband was suddenly leveling her with. I was given to understand you didn't want to lay eyes on her, Astoria. Was that wrong? Malfoy said. His tone was light, almost cajoling, but there was a freezing edge to it. Would you rather I trot her around with me? Take her along to the opera? Perhaps have her join us on the cover of the Daily Prophet for the next New Year's? The whole world already knows she's mine. Do you want me to reiterate it? Astoria paled visibly and glanced over at Hermione with undisguised loathing. I don't care what you do with her, Astoria snarled, then turned on her heel and stormed away. The instability in the air evaporated with the receding sound of footsteps. Malfoy stared after Astoria with an expression of annoyance. He turned to direct his scowl towards Hermione. You've irritated my wife, mudblood, he said. Hermione looked up at him. He almost seemed to expect her to apologize. My existence irritates her, she replied indifferently. She eyed him. If you care, you could easily remedy that. He snorted and looked her over. That potion really does a number on you, he said. He looked at her so intently it felt as though he was committing her to memory. She met his gaze calmly. She wished she could be so calm without feeling like she were frozen. There were so many things about him she wanted to unravel and exploit. If she could only rein in her psyche and manage herself. There was so much about him that made little sense to her. If she could only get closer. I feel like I can breathe, she said. Like I've been drowning so long I forgot what oxygen felt like. Then she grimaced. The withdrawals leave you something to be desired, though, she added. He laughed, and his eyes finally left her face. If I didn't leave you on the floor retching, you might make the mistake of thinking I care, he said in a dismissive tone. Hermione looked up at him. You seem surprisingly concerned about my thinking such a thing, she said coolly. Malfoy paused and stared at her again for a moment before a slow, cat-like smile graced his lips. Are we moving on from the agenda, then? He drawled out. Hermione's eyes narrowed. What was it again? Explore the south wing, trying to find the kitchens, look for a garden, shed, or stables, found Malfoy, and try to find a weakness to exploit. Are we that far down already? You're quite efficient. Hermione stared at him. She wanted to be angry, but the potion had such a reaction carefully stifled. You were in my head last night, she said at last. I was trying to sleep, but you were thinking rather loudly, he said in a bland tone, picking a non-existent piece of lint from his robes and surveying his foyer as though he were an interior decorator. Well, have fun, he said after a moment. The stables are beyond the rose gardens on the south side of the manor, and the garden shed is on the far side of the hedge maze. I have it on good authority that you cannot touch pruning shears or pitchforks. You might be able to try strangling me with a bridle, but somehow I doubt you could bring yourself to actually do it. He smirked down at her wrist before turning and ascending the staircase without another word. Hermione stood and watched him disappear down a hallway and then glanced around, mulling him over as she calculated her next move. He had been reading her mind the night before. She wasn't surprised, but it made anything she did feel horrendously futile. He didn't even need to wait to perform legacy on her. He could just glean her schemes and from the forefront of her mind. She went back to her room and put on her cloak and changed into her boots. As she exited the manor at the veranda, she began mentally counting upward by 2. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. As she counted, she let her mind meander, thinking lazily. Draco Malfoy was an enigma. There were so many contradictions swirling beneath his cold facade. What were his ambitions? 22, 24, 26, 28. He seemed to be accumulating power without having any specific purpose for it. He knew he was shackled by orders he couldn't disobey. Marry Astoria, sully his bloodline with half-bloods, keep Hermione under constant supervision. He followed Voldemort's commands with devotion despite having no apparent taste for them. What did he get from it? What was it that drove him? His power and status seemed pointless. He didn't even seem to be getting anything from it that he wouldn't have had as a mid-tier Death Eater. 66, 68, 70, 72. Of course, Hermione might be missing something. He spent days away during which she had no idea what he did. There could be countless things he was doing that she had no knowledge of. There was something she was overlooking. A detail she felt she knew subconsciously, but couldn't place. Something. Like a puzzle she was piecing together, built from all the contradictory information she had been accumulating in her mind. 132, 134, 136. She felt something in the back of her mind crack, and a page of a well-worn notebook filled with her writing swam before her eyes. The fanfare is in the light, but the execution is in the dark, the purpose being always to mislead. Intention is revealed to divert the attention of the adversary. Then it is changed to gain the end by what was unexpected. But insight is wise, wary, and waits behind its armor, sensing always the opposite of what it was to sense and recognizing at once the real purpose of the trick. It allows every first hint to pass, lies in wait for a second, and even a third. The simulation of truth now mounts higher by glossing the description and tries, through truth itself, to falsify. It changed the play in order to change the trick, and makes the reason appear the phantom by founding the greatest fraud upon the greatest candor. But wariness is on watch, seeing clearly what is intended, covering the darkness that was clothed in light, and recognizing that design most artful which looks most artless. In such fashion, the willingness of Python is matched against the simplicity of Apollo's penetrating rays. Hermione paused, wondering where the words had come from. It wasn't a book she could recall. She had memorized the words. As soon as she saw the memory, she recalled memorizing them. The fanfare is in the light, but the execution is in the dark. She repeated the words to herself several times. Then she started counting by 3 as she proceeded on her way through the hedge maze in the direction that Malfoy had claimed the garden shed was. The day passed pointlessly, filled with counting. There was nothing useful she could find during her final exploration of the Malfoy estate. The garden shed Malfoy directed to was locked. She did discover that Malfoy kept a stable of winged horses, enormous Abraxans, Granians, and Athenians, all of which stared down at her through barred stable doors and stomped their hoods when she got close. A dainty Granian was the only one who didn't step back when Hermione approached. It fluttered its smoky wings and shoved its nose through the bars, nickering and tossing its head at Hermione. Hermione lightly stroked its velvety muzzle and felt the warmth of its huffing breath against her palm. If Hermione's mind hadn't been smothered, she might have cried at the realization that a horse was the first warm and gentle thing to touch her in years. She stood for several minutes, petting the horse's forehead and lightly scratching its chin while it nuzzled her robes in the hope of finding an apple or a carrot. When it realized Hermione had nothing to offer it, it pulled its narrow head back through the bars and ignored her. Hermione lingered there for longer than she should have. Hermione took the paths and found the entrance of Malfoy Manor. Large iron-wrought gates stood closed and would not open for her. Hermione wasn't sure what she would have done if they had. She wandered across as much of the estate as she could. Hermione found the family cemetery, countless headstones and mausoleums buried under snow. The Malfoy family was ancient. Only one mausoleum was carefully cleared of snow. On each side of the door there were enchanted daffodils blooming. Hermione studied the words carved into the marble. Narcissa Black Malfoy, beloved wife and mother. Astra in Licante, sed non obligate. A large headstone for Bellatrix Lestrange stood nearby, the black family crest adorning the marble. Toujours pur. Hermione left the cemetery and continued exploring the estate. It felt endless, isolated, uninterrupted snowy hills stretching out as far as she could see, blindingly white under the clear blue sky. When night fell, Hermione continued wandering, staring up at the constellations until she felt the potion's effect begin fading away. She felt so ill the next morning she thought she was dying. She vomited off the side of the bed, and it took her hours before she could drag herself into the bathroom. She didn't know if she could become immune to the potion, but she didn't think it was possible to continue surviving it to find out. Even Malfoy sent it. Even if Malfoy sent it, she doubted she'd be able to handle dosing herself again. She was sick for 2 days, pressed against the window as she shivered and sweated the potion from her system, mulling over Malfoy and the drawing room in the south wing again and again, when she wasn't too feverish to even think coherently. On the second night, she dreamt of Ginny. Ginny was huddled next to a bed and quietly sobbing. She turned sharply when Hermione entered the room. Ginny's expression as she turned and caught sight of Hermione was anguished. Her chest was stuttering sharply, and ragged breaths were being gasped rapidly through her open mouth. Even her red hair was wet with tears. As Hermione approached, Ginny's hair slipped back and exposed a long, cruel scar twisting down the side of her face, from her forehead down to the jaw. "Ginny?" Hermione said. "Ginny, what's wrong? What happened?" "I don't know." Ginny forced the words out and then started crying harder. Hermione knelt down to her friend and hugged her. "Oh God, Hermione!" Ginny gasped. "I don't know how." Ginny broke off as she struggled to breathe. Choked, hiccuping sounds emerged from deep in her throat as she struggled against her spasming lungs. "It's all right. Breathe. You need to breathe. Then tell me what's wrong and I'll help you," Hermione promised as she ran her hands up and down Ginny's shoulders. "Just breathe. In a count of 4. Hold it and then out through your nose for a count of 6. We'll build up to that, okay? I'll breathe with you, all right? Come on, breathe with me. I've got you." Ginny just cried harder. "It's all right," Hermione kept saying as she started taking deep, demonstrative breaths for Ginny to follow. She held Ginny tight in her arms so that the younger girl would feel Hermione's chest expanding and contracting slowly as a subconscious cue. Ginny kept crying for several more minutes before her sobs slowed and her breathing slowly began mirroring Hermione's. "Do you want to tell me what's wrong, or would you rather I go get someone else?" Hermione asked when she was sure Ginny was not going to keep hyperventilating. "No, you can't," Ginny said immediately. "Oh God, I don't." Ginny started sobbing into Hermione's shoulder again. She was still crying when Hermione woke from the dream. Hermione replayed the memory in her mind. Ginny had rarely cried. When Percy died, she had cried for days, but as the war wore on, her tears had dried up along with everyone else's. Ginny had barely cried when Arthur was cursed or when George nearly died. Hermione couldn't remember Ginny ever crying so much. Hermione kept turning the memory over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of it. She couldn't remember the scar on Ginny's face. It had appeared to be several months old in the memory, but Hermione had no recollection of when Ginny could have gotten it. It had looked like someone had cruelly carved out a section of Ginny's face with a knife. Hermione wondered if she had been the one who had healed it. And that is the end of chapter 14. And we will finish out with chapter 15. So here we go. Chapter 15. Chapter 15. Hermione was fertile again. The table reappeared in the middle of the floor, and she felt resigned by the sight. It had started to feel inevitable. Hermione realized with a dropping sensation that she was growing accustomed to her cage. Malfoy was going to rape her over a table, and the thought had become matter of fact to her. Even the word rape had started to feel faintly inaccurate. Everything had started to feel less. Physically and mentally, the dread had begun to fade as her mind forced her to adapt. She didn't feel nauseated. Her heart didn't pound painfully. The wrenching sensation in her stomach didn't feel so oppressive she thought she might be choking from it. Her mind was twisting itself up with the rationalization, trying to make her adapt, to make her survive. If her situation ceased to chafe, she'd be less likely to risk an escape attempt, less likely to provoke Malfoy. She could understand it scientifically. From the perspective of a healer, she could explain the physiology and psychology of it. It was understandable to remain in a state of constant fear. It was unsustainable to remain in a state of constant fear, constant horror, constant dread. Her body couldn't keep her in a permanent state of fight or flight. She would either be forced to adapt or she'd burn out. The potion Malfoy had dosed her with had probably aided to the dulling of it. Understanding the signs didn't make the realization better. It made it worse. She knew where her mind was headed. It was acclimating to the manor. The thought shook her to the core. She stared at the table and felt at a loss as what to do about it. It wasn't as though she could fight him. She couldn't resist any more than she already was. He wasn't doing anything that hurt. If she paid attention, stopped pulling her mind away, it would likely make it worse rather than better. She had to escape. That was all there was to it. She had to escape. Had to find a way. There had to be a way. No cage was perfect. No one was perfect. There had to be something in Malfoy to exploit. She just had to find out what it was. She had to. She had to. She kept repeating the resolution to herself even as she walked across the room and leaned across the table, feet apart. Don't think about it, she told herself. Worse things could happen if she let herself think about it. I'm going to escape, she promised herself. I'm going to go somewhere where people are kind and warm and I am free. She squeezed her eyes shut and mouthed the promise to herself again and again until she heard the door click. She watched the days of January slip by. Malfoy came for 5 days. On the 6th day, he arrived and wordlessly inspected her memories. He seemed preoccupied. Then she was left to her own devices. She folded origami. She explored the manor. She explored the estate. She read the newspaper. Reports on the war efforts were getting relegated to smaller columns. Public fascination with the surrogates was slowly beginning to swallow the society pages. They were appearing more and more frequently in public, trotted about, taken along to the opera, treated as though they were exotic pets. Pictures of their bonneted figures were being featured along with aggressive gossiping. Was it swelling or merely the fit of their robes? Unnamed sources said suggestive things like, there's a chance the Flints will be adding a name to the family tapestry by the end of the year. Healer Stroud was tight-lipped with reporters, which only served as to fuel for further speculation. Hermione's panic attacks almost seemed a thing of the past. She had measured out her limitations and tried not to exceed them. When she remained focused and occupied herself with studying portraits and exploring the manor and the grounds, she was able to stay calm. When she tried not to think about the war and how everyone was dead. She gradually got so good at keeping herself preoccupied that she would momentarily forget that she was forgetting. She'd breathe in and experience a moment that she didn't feel broken or grieving or despairing. When it was just her loneliness that stretched out before her. The guilt that would strike her a moment later was as cold and bitter as the seawater. She'd freeze for a moment and then swallow the lump of horror in her throat and renew her vow to escape. But she couldn't escape. She'd explored the manor from top to bottom. She found a set of wizard's chess and played matches against herself. She built card towers with packs of cards she discovered in a drawer. She visited the horses. There was no way to escape. She tried to find Malfoy but never managed to. She didn't know if he were even in the manor. He could have just been out or just behind a door she couldn't open. It sometimes felt as though he must be avoiding her. She had no idea how she could possibly escape. Hermione began to see Astoria with increasing regularity. The familiar click of heels in the distance, and Hermione grew adept at promptly disappearing behind a curtain or into the servants' passage. The servants' passages were filled with cleverly concealed peepholes. Hermione suspected, given the utilization of house elves, the twisty little tunnels had always been primarily used for spying. The manor was crammed with them. Some were obvious and others extremely well concealed. Hermione found them all. Anytime the dimensions of a room seemed vaguely off, Hermione set to work, tapping lightly along the walls and pressing every knot in the wood and twisting at every sconce and screw until she felt something give. Some doors appeared magically, while others were cleverly built using gears and rotating furniture. Astoria was rarely alone when Hermione saw her. She was accompanied by the same dark, broad-shouldered man Hermione had glimpsed on New Year's. It soon became apparent that either Astoria or her paramour had some sort of objection to beds. The first time Hermione encountered them, Astoria was nearly naked and pressed against a parlor window. They seemed to be trying to have sex in every room of the manor. Hermione did her best to avoid them. She didn't particularly fancy the thought of Malfoy using her memories to watch as his wife was Hermione did her best to avoid them. She didn't particularly fancy the thought of Malfoy using her memories to watch as his wife was shagged from all angles. Hermione entered the notion of watching just to spite him, but then dismissed it. Malfoy didn't appear to care about what Astoria did. It would probably have no effect on him. It would just be extremely uncomfortable for Hermione. Whenever Hermione stumbled across Astoria mid-coitus, she would quickly avert her eyes and slip away. For a time, she merely caught glimpses of the paramours For a time, she merely caught glimpses of the amorous pair while fleeing, but eventually, Hermione came across them both fully clothed. Hermione had been wandering through the topmost floor of the north wing when she caught sight of them strolling along the gravel path running along the hedge maze. Astoria was speaking animatedly, and as she spoke, the man beside her turned and stared up at the north wing. As Hermione watched, she finally caught sight of his face. Graham Montague. Hermione stared down in shock as his eyes carefully scanned the lower windows of the north wing. When he craned his neck back further, Hermione stepped back sharply and out of sight. Hermione's heart was suddenly pounding. Graham Montague was Astoria's lover. Montague, who had just happened to come across Hermione during New Year's Eve party, who had expected Hermione to immediately recognize him. He was having an affair with Astoria. He was visiting the manor almost daily. He was looking up towards the window where Hermione's room was with an expression of intense determination. Was it all a coincidence? Could it even possibly be a coincidence? Hermione reviewed all the scenarios she could think of. What did she know of him? Slytherin. Former member of the Inquisitorial Squad, badly injured by Fred and George. At some point during the war, Hermione had known him and forgotten it. He was having an affair with Astoria, and he seemed to be looking for Hermione. Was he a Death Eater? Hermione didn't know. Unless he had been working in the Ministry, he would have had to join Voldemort's army in some capacity. He seemed too high socially to have been merely a snatcher, and he hadn't demonstrated much familiarity with the Ministry officials at the New Year's Eve party. Hermione replayed everything she could recall from the night. She'd been so absorbed watching Malfoy and then the surrogates, she hadn't connected that Astoria and Montague had been missing at the same time. When she'd watched him later in the evening, he'd just been mingling, but he seemed most familiar with Marcus Flint and Adrian Pusey. Despite her uncertain memory regarding the war, Hermione was fairly certain that Flint and Pusey had been, last she recalled, mid-tier, unmarked Death Eaters. Earning a death mark had been considered significant distinction, an admission into Voldemort's most select inner circle. As Voldemort's hold on Europe had grown more certain, he had marked fewer and fewer followers. Therefore, the logical conclusion was that Montague was also a Death Eater. Marked or unmarked, she didn't know. But that didn't explain why he would have any interest in or acquaintance with Hermione. Unless... could he? Hermione was half afraid to even contemplate the notion, to allow the thought to exist in her mind where Malfoy might find it, but she couldn't stop herself from thinking it. Could Montague have been a spy for the Resistance? Could he still be? Could that be why he's trying to communicate to her before he'd left with Malfoy? She started watching Astoria and Montague carefully whenever they weren't having sex. She spied on them from the secret passages and grew increasingly convinced that Montague had ulterior motives for being in the manor. He was extremely interested in the house, and his eyes wandered strangely whenever Astoria was distracted. Hermione's wrist Hermione weighed the risk of trying to approach him. He was rarely alone. Astoria didn't ever seem to go more than a few yards away from him. On the few occasions when Hermione did spot him alone, she hesitated. He felt so unfamiliar. Surely, if he were someone she trusted, she'd feel it instinctively. She tried to reason with herself. If he were a member of the resistance and she were to approach him prematurely, she might expose him. If he didn't have a way to remove the manacles, it would all be futile. Hermione decided to bide her time and continue watching. Better unconfirmed suspicions than anything concrete for Malfoy to get from her. She kept wavering. Healer Stroud came and found that Hermione was, once again, not pregnant. Her expression as she surveyed the diagnostic results seemed irritated. Hermione stared determinedly at the clock on the wall. "Why are your sodium levels so low?" Healer Stroud asked after performing several more tests on Hermione. Hermione glanced over. "They don't provide any salt with the food." "They don't?" Healer Stroud said in a tone of surprise. "What are they feeding you?" Hermione shrugged. "Boiled things, vegetables and meats and eggs and rye bread." "Why?" "I assumed it was what they were instructed to feed me. It's not as though I have the freedom to question anything," Hermione said coldly. "You're supposed to have a balanced diet. That includes salt," Healer Stroud said with an expression of annoyance. She reached forward and tapped the manacle on Hermione's wrist with the tip of her wand. A minute later, Malfoy entered with a scowl. "You called," he said. "Yes. Is there a reason why she isn't being given any salt?" Healer Stroud said. Malfoy blinked. "Salt?" "She says her food is all boiled and has no salt. It's starting to affect her sodium levels," Healer Stroud said. Her eyes narrowed as she stared at Malfoy. Malfoy's eyebrows went up in apparent surprise. "The elves were instructed to provide her with meals. I assumed she was eating what Astoria and I do," he said. Then his jaw clenched slightly and his own eyes narrowed. "Astoria is responsible for approving the menu. I'll find out what happened." "Please do. The Dark Lord is growing impatient over the lack of progress. We don't want anything interfering." "Indeed," Malfoy said coolly, meeting Healer Stroud's gaze. "Now, if there's nothing else, I must return to my work." "Of course, High Reeve. I won't keep you," Healer Stroud said, giving him a final look before turning back to Hermione. That night, Hermione received a full meal with side dishes and a fresh salad, seasoning, and most significantly to her, a salt shaker. She hadn't realized how much she had missed salt until she finally had it again. In retrospect, it wasn't exactly surprising to realize Astoria had decided to order the house elves to keep Hermione on some kind of prison food, peasant's fare. Hermione wasn't even sure what it had been intended to be. The woman was odd. Her indignance over Hermione seemed to manifest in whatever strange way she thought she could get away with. And gone away with it she had, for 3 months. Approximately 270 meals. Hermione never wanted to eat another overboiled vegetable again. Malfoy entered Hermione's room when she was almost done eating and walked over to survey the plate of her food on the plate. To survey the food on her plate. "Apparently, I'm obliged to personally assure everything," he said with a scowl after the meal apparently met his expectations. "You could have mentioned it. If I were to start complaining, the food would not be the first thing I bring up," Hermione replied, stabbing a tomato viciously with her fork. He gave her a thin smile. "No, I don't suppose it would be." He walked over to the window and stared out over the estate while she finished eating. She intentionally took her time and mentally recited all the irritating, repetitive songs she'd learned in primary school. As she finished, she glanced over to him. She could see his profile and noticed as his eyes became briefly unfocused. "I hope you die in the slowest, most horrible death anyone has ever devised, Malfoy," she immediately snarled into her mind. After a moment, he blinked and glanced over toward her, expressionless. She met his gaze unapologetically. "Noted," he said, and then gestured toward the bed. Hermione walked over resigningly and seated herself on the edge before looking up at him, unblinking as his cold eye sank into her consciousness. She always ended up flat on her back by the time he finished going through her memories. He watched her memory of Ginny several times. Then he watched her spying and wondering about Graham Montague. He withdrew from her mind. Montague got a dark mark after the final battle, he said, staring down at her. It was, I am told, an acknowledgement of the exceptional services he rendered. He was sneering as he said it. Did you provide exceptional services too? She asked, gazing up at Malfoy. She had no idea if he were lying to her about Montague, whether he would bother to do so. He stared down at her and gave a cruel, righteous smile. More exceptional than Montague's, he said. Then the smile faded. He kept looking at her, studying her face carefully, and then flicking his eyes down over the rest of her. His gaze seemed softer and darker than usual. She realized belatedly that she was lying supine on a bed before him. She felt her skin prickle. She sat up quickly. He stared down at her for another moment before glancing away and staring at the wall behind her. If you have any hopes involving Montague, you should let them die, he said coolly. Then he turned and left. A week later, Hermione had a new dream about Ginny. Hermione was standing in her bedroom in Grimmauld Place when Ginny walked in. You're back early, Ginny said. Hermione glanced down at her watch. Lucky day, Hermione said. Yeah, said Ginny, looking slightly awkward. I wanted to ask you about something. Hermione waited. Ginny tugged nervously at her hair. Her face was unblemished. Well, you obviously know about me and Harry, Ginny said. Hermione gave a short nod. Right. Well, the thing is, I want to be careful. I've been using the charm, but there's something about Pruitts. They're not like other wizarding families. They just get pregnant somehow. Ron and I were both accidents after the twins came along. So, I was wondering if you'd make a contraceptive potion. If you have the time. I was always rubbish at potions. If you can't, that's fine. I can ask Padma. I know you're already terribly busy. I didn't want you to think I didn't want to ask you first. Of course, I'll be brewing tonight anyway. It will be an easy thing to include. Do you have any preference about taste? The most effective ones don't taste very pleasant. I don't care what it tastes like, if it works, Ginny said boldly. Well, I've already got a few vials of one variety. I can give them to you now if you'd like. You do? Ginny blinked and stared at Hermione suspiciously. Are you... Hermione could see Ginny running a list of possible men in Hermione's life. You're not... with Snape, are you? Ginny suddenly choked. Hermione gaped. God! No! She sputtered. I'm a healer. I keep a lot of things on hand. Good grief, why would you even... Ginny looked slightly abashed. He's just the only person you ever seem to talk to for long. Aside from Fred, who's with Angelina, everyone else you just end up fighting with. And not in that hot, bothered, angsty sex later kind of way. That doesn't mean I'm shagging him, Hermione muttered, feeling as though her face were about to burst into flames. He's a colleague. I consult with him about potions. You just seem lonely, Ginny said, giving Hermione a long look. Hermione started and stared at Ginny. You don't talk to anyone nowadays, Ginny said. You used to always be with Ron and Harry, but even before you left to become a healer, you've seemed more and more alone. I thought maybe you had someone. Granted, Snape would be a weird choice for a lot of reasons, but it's a war. It's too much for anyone to handle alone. Cathartic shagging is Ron's thing, not mine, Hermione said stiffly. Besides, it's not like I'm fighting. Ginny looked at her pensively for a moment before saying, I think that the hospital ward is worse than the battlefield. Hermione looked away. She had sometimes wondered if it might be, but it had never been a question she could ask anyone. Ginny continued, I think of it every time I'm in there. In the field, everything is so focused. Even when someone's injured, you just apparate them away and then head back. You win some, you lose some, you get hit sometimes, you hit back, and then you get days to recover if it's bad, or if your dueling partner dies. But in the hospital ward, every battle looks like losing. I'm always more traumatized after being in there than I am by fighting. Hermione was silent. And you don't ever get time off, Ginny said. You're on duty for every skirmish. They can never spare you, not even to let you grieve. I know from Harry and Ron that you're still pushing for the dark arts when you go to the order meetings. I don't agree, but I get it. I realize that you see the war from a different angle than the rest of us. Probably the worst one. So, I'm just saying, If you had someone, I'd be really happy for you, even if it was Snape. Hermione rolled her eyes. You should probably stop talking now if you want that contraceptive potion, Hermione said with a glare. Hermione woke in a state of shock. Ginny and Harry had been together. Ginny and Harry had been together, and Hermione had no memory of it. There was not so much of a trace of it in her recollection. She'd forgotten it entirely. Harry and Ginny's relationship had been something she'd forgotten intentionally? Was that what Hermione had been hiding? Ginny had still been alive when Hermione was imprisoned. Ginny hadn't been in the final battle. She hadn't been tortured to death alongside the rest of the Weasleys. Hermione had thought Ginny was still alive until Hannah had told her about the High Reeve. If Voldemort had known of Ginny's unique significance to Harry, her death would have been horrific. Far worse than even what had been inflicted upon the rest of the Weasleys. Hermione would have done anything to protect Ginny, stolen away her own memories to try to spare her. For Harry, for Ginny herself. Ginny had been a constant friend during the war. Not close, but ever constant in her friendship with Hermione, even when schisms had developed in many of Hermione's other relationships. Ginny and Luna and Hermione had roomed together in Grimmauld Place until Luna died. But Ginny was dead. Malfoy had hunted her down and killed her. Hermione felt like she was going to be sick. Was it really all that pointless? She'd locked away her past to protect Ginny, not knowing Ginny had already died. She locked away her past to protect Ginny, not knowing Ginny had already died? Hermione had gone handed over to Malfoy and dragged in front of Voldemort, and it was all to protect someone who was already dead? And Snape? Hermione had tried very hard since her release to not allow herself to think about Snape. She thought he'd been on their side. He trained her into a potion mistress. He had devoted countless hours of his personal time to do so. Shortly after Dumbledore had been killed, she had descended into the dungeons to Snape's door and asked in a steady voice, "If there's a battle, what potion should I know how to make? That I probably wouldn't be able to find or buy anywhere." Rather than sneer and slam the door in her face, he had invited her into his office. Until Hogwarts was shut down, she had spent every evening until late into the night in his office, brewing one exacting complicated potion after Potion. When Hogwarts was abandoned, he continued to teach her at Grimmauld Place. The enigmatic man, enigmatic man had slowly seemed to thaw from pure exhaustion as he trained her. He had no energy for insults. He was hard and demanding, but generous with his knowledge. He had seemed to be one of the only other people who was also bracing himself for a very long war. He shoved stacks of his own personal annotated potions text into her arms to read and drew up maps to where to forage for her own ingredients when there were so few sources to buy them. In the middle of the night and early in the mornings, he took her with him all over England. He would apparate from location to location to teach her how to find plants and harvest them so that the potency stayed high. He taught her how to build snares and catch and humanely kill the animals and magical creatures needed for potion ingredients. He didn't even say anything when she cried after killing her first murtlap. He had trained her until she qualified for a potion mastery. She had been his staunchest defender during the war. Charlie Weasley grew to hate her for siding with Snape over almost anyone else. She defended Snape's method and everything he did as a Death Eater as necessary. She protected him when Harry and Ron had wanted to have him removed from the Order. She considered him more than a colleague or a mentor. He had been someone she had trusted implicitly. But it had all been a ruse, a clever ploy. Without Dumbledore to vouch for him, he had cultivated a new champion for himself, twisted her around his finger by being generous with his knowledge. He'd bought her loyalty with a potion mastery. Then, once victorious, he'd cast her off. He'd had a chance to spare her from being included in the breeding program, and he declined. He had departed for Romania and left her to be bred, to be raped. It was such a bitter and deeply personal betrayal, she could barely bring herself to think about it. She got up and read the newspaper. That is the end of chapter 15. Oh my goodness, it is 4 a.m. I started at, I think, like 12:30. So we just finished. I just read 2 episodes for the Good Girls Club back to back. I hope you enjoyed it. I do hope you leave a comment. What are your thoughts about Snape? What do you think about the Ginny, the memory that she had of Ginny? That is a very important piece. Don't forget that piece. Thank you so much for listening, and the next 3 chapters will be read at the next Smutty Saturday in the Smut Hut, and we'll be reading chapter 16, 17, and 18 next time. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being in the Good Girls Club.